Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Scott Conry. He is Vice President, Head of Oncology Medical Affairs for GSK. And we talk about why medical affairs needs more leadership. It's an awesome conversation. Scott's amazing. I know you guys are going to love this. So don't forget to follow me on LinkedIn and check us out the first Tuesday of every month, typically at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time for our MSL Talk Live, which is a live version of this podcast with a panel. And I think you'll love those. So thank you for listening, and we appreciate all your support. Welcome to MSL Talk with Tom Caravela, a podcast specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. Hey, Scott, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for asking me to be on, Tom.
Yeah, man, I'm excited. So, guys, you know how I like to give a little context to how these things come about. So I run into Scott at ASCO this year, and we got to talking, and he had a really good idea for a podcast episode, and here we are. So can't wait to jump into this. But before I do that, as always, Scott, why don't you do a quick intro, tell everybody who you are, where you're from, all that good stuff.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Tom. So Scott Conry, I'm the Vice President of Oncology Field Medical for GlaxoSmithKline. My passion is leadership development. I've been in people leader roles for the past 20 years of my career. And I'm at a stage of my career where I really want to leave a place better than I found it. And, you know, how I do that is really developing leaders behind me. So when I'm ready to move on, I have a bench and a talent pipeline to step in and lead better than I did when I'm gone.
Awesome. Well, we're going to talk about leadership today. We're excited. And but before we do that, we do have a sponsor for today's episode. Our sponsor is Aspire MSL, which is a coaching program that Sarah Snyder and I developed. It is an online course, which is a step-by-step guide on how to land your first medical science liaison role. So any aspiring MSLs that are out there, check it out. You can go to mslmastery.com for details, and we love to have you join our program. So, Scott, let's get into this. So you had this idea of talking about why medical affairs needs more leaders and why medical affairs specifically doesn't do the best job in developing leaders. So where did this come from? Where did this come about? Let's start there.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from my observations throughout my career. I've had the pleasure of working for some amazing leaders. I've also had the pleasure of working for some awful leaders too. And it might sound odd to say the pleasure, but you learn from great leaders, but you also learn from leaders that are not so strong, right? Because you know how it affects you and you know how it feels to work for them. It doesn't mean you can't take some positives away from them, but you also learn a lot of what not to do. And if there's a common theme in some of the poor leaders that I have worked for, a lot of them are old school, like command and control type leaders from the perspective of, we design the strategy, we tell you what the tactics are, it's your job to do it, right? Don't ask me any questions. It's your job to carry it out. I once had a leader tell me, I was a first line leader at the time, managing a team of MSLs at a former company. And I'm the type of leader that really wants to create psychological safety with my team so they can come and tell me, what's working well, but more importantly, what's not working well.
Right.
They're the individuals in the field in front of our customers that impact our patients every day. We need to understand what's not working and how we support them to give them the tools to succeed and remove the barriers that are in their way and create that environment. And so, that's how I always position myself as a leader and do to this day. And so I brought feedback to my boss that, about there were a lot of challenges in this particular organization. I brought challenges on how we can improve, et cetera. And he said, Scott, you're not a leader, you're a manager. It's your job to have your team carry out the strategy we put in place. And I don't want to hear what's not working, and I don't want to hear what people are complaining about. And I'm like,
wow.
And it was that day, Tom, that I said, I need a new place to work. because
Yeah.
it doesn't align with how I want to lead. And I had to know we had a lot of turnover in this organization, specifically because of the toxic senior leadership environment. And I got so sick, and I had two people resign on me the same day once. That's a record I hope not to break sometime. And at least one was at the beginning of the day, one was at the end of the day. But I got so tired of having conversations with my people where they're like, Scott, we thought, like, we love working for you. We thought you were going to be able to change it here. But I probably stayed a year longer than I would have because I had faith in you. And it led me to looking in the mirror one day, and I'm like, why am I here? And so, but what in trying to like peel back the onion a little bit, I'm like, what makes leaders like that? One of the things that I recognized is when you look at medical affairs leaders, traditionally they used to all be MDs, but now organizations are more flexible. You see PharmDs leading, you see PhDs, more and more nurses are coming into medical liaison roles and starting to ascend to leadership also. But what common thread with medical professionals and how we're trained, and I'm a PharmD by training, is we're trained to be scientific experts. You're either right or you're wrong, right? There's no gray area. And all of us, when we're in our clinical years of professional school, we're usually rounding in an academic hospital with a multidisciplinary healthcare team, and we're a student and we have our notebook, and you go from patient to patient, and your attending professor will just hit you with 20 questions. Okay, what's wrong with the patient? What tests do we need to run? This is the result. What should we do? And if you answer wrong, it's like, no, that's the wrong answer. You go find the wrong answer and come back to me. And that's how we're trained. Yeah. So when medical professionals, if they come into the business world, often they're in an individual contributor role to begin with, which aligns with their expertise. But those who are really good at that role, they often get moved into a leadership role. And most of them have no training for people leadership, but they default to kind of that command and control. Do you have the right answer? Do you have the wrong answer? No, this is how I said to do it, and move on. And the generation of workers that are, with us today, and more, I look at the people that work for me and they're the age of my kids, and I'm like, oh, they're a different generation than I am. That they don't relate to that. They really want to say in their work environment, they really want to say, what's the purpose of the organization? How do I have an impact? And that type of leadership doesn't work. So there's a huge need to develop leaders in medical affairs organizations early on, aligned to the purpose and where you have more like a trust and inspire leadership. And I'm speaking, there's a Stephen Covey book called Trust and Inspire Leadership, where it's talking about, gaining trust of your people and then inspiring them around a purpose versus command and control. But you can even go back to Jim Collins. My favorite leadership book is Good to Great, which I read probably 20 years ago, right? He talks about the level 5 leader. And the level 5 leader, looks through the window and not in the mirror. So essentially, looks through the window at all the people in their organization and says, we are successful because of these people. And I need, as a leader, it's my job to set them up for success, and invariably I'll be successful, versus looking in the mirror and saying, well, we're great because of me as a leader. Might be aligned to the old Lee Iacocca type leader who was all about them. But what you see with those leaders is when they leave organizations, they may make things happen, but then the organizations fall flat because there isn't someone behind them. So, those are just, like a few nuggets on why I think there needs to be just more dedicated people leadership, because people from a medical affairs or a medical background just don't naturally have the skills to align with today's generation of workers and really leading effectively.
Yeah, and I think listening to you, I hear problems. I hear a lot of problems. And on my side of it, being a recruiter and being on the staffing side, I can tell you, and you've probably heard this before, a lot of people here, people don't leave jobs, they leave toxic environments, they leave bad bosses. And you're describing that. So here's the dilemma. The dilemma is what you're saying is it sounds like medical affairs doesn't naturally develop. Medical affairs folks aren't naturally good leaders. They need to be developed. But it doesn't sound like medical affairs and pharma companies are actually doing a great job in helping those people develop. So what's your advice for somebody that wants to be a leader or maybe is a leader but needs to grow?
Yeah, it's tough because it's very difficult to do on your own. If you want to be a people leader, to find the resources and the support to help you grow and develop. I would implore anybody in an organization who has a desire to be a people leader to really tap into the organizational development portion of the company and see what type of leadership development courses exist within the company. What you often see in the pharmaceutical industry is there is a very well laid out leadership development, talent management plans for commercial portions of an organization. It makes sense. It's the largest part of the organization. So people are identified pretty early on in the commercial group as far as, talent pipeline future leaders. On the medical side, we do it to a degree, but there often isn't the same level of like rigor and structure to get someone who, say, is like 3 years out from being a leader into a new leader development course, right? Get them into a new leader development course where they get exposure to a number of things. You'll do a 360 on someone. You'll do social style programs. You actually get what is your leadership style based on your own social personality style, right? And what happens with these early new leader development programs is you can build out a profile of an individual and find out like what they really do well, but also areas they need to grow and develop, and then tie that to their development plan, right? And you can have a timeline saying, some of these people might be ready in a year, but some might be 3 years out. That's okay. Everybody develops at a different time, but then be very purposeful with their development and give them the opportunities to lead in small ways, either lead small teams, lead task forces, maybe do an ad interim role as a leader, but also understand maybe where some of their deficiencies are, which would interfere with them being a more effective leader, and let them grow and develop. So then when the first line leader role opens up, you as an organization have a group of people. You're like, hey, there's like 4 people that are ready today. And those individuals feel like they're ready to step into the role. You see it on the commercial side, but you don't see it so much on the medical affairs side or other organizations that don't have the same number of workers within the group. You think of other small parts of the company, like maybe a compliance group or the legal group, and everyone from the different parts of the organization, they should go through the same leadership development program. It's leading people is leading people. Yeah. Your functional expertise is going to be different. And depending on the type of people you have underneath you, how you lead them might be different, but leading people is leading people. So, I think organizations need to do a better job from a holistic perspective of looking at the organization as a whole and implementing what they may have in place for commercial, but really making sure it touches all parts of the organization to develop your leaders early on.
And you and I talked about this a little bit, but as we talk about that piece of it, which is organizations developing leaders, you said the commercial side does a better job. So on the medical affairs side, I've seen companies, and we talked about the fact that a lot of organizations just outsource this part to vendors. So vendors are handling most of this. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Talk about whether or not it makes more sense to do this in a homegrown fashion or to outsource some or all of this to vendors.
Yeah, I see a trend. Early in my career, I worked in an organization. I was in a training role at the time where I trained medical affairs more from the technical component, but I worked in a broader training department that had an entire leadership development wing, if you will. There were like 4 people. They were former field leaders, mostly commercial, but their goal was leadership development in the organization. But I've seen that really shift over the years to more and more vendors, and which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it may be difficult within an organization to source people with expertise in leadership development. I mean, it's a specialty in and of itself. And so just because someone has ascended to a leader role in their career, and they could be a great leader, doesn't mean they necessarily can teach leadership from the development perspective. So farming it out to vendors is not necessarily a bad thing. I think especially if you have a clear plan for what you want to do. One of the challenges I have seen, since some organizations do it really well and others don't, is really having a clear curriculum for leaders. So, identifying people early on who may be in an individual contributor role who want to be a future leader, and getting them into a talent pipeline and having like an early development program prior to, so you understand when are they ready to be a leader soon, where their deficiencies, where they do well, etc. Then when someone becomes a first line leader for the first time, it's critical within the first 6 months in that role, maybe first 12 on the going out a little bit, or really the first 6 months, get that person in a new leader development program. Because now, even in the in the future leader program, you're still kind of role playing, right? You're not in a leader role. You kind of play, oh, if I was a leader of people, I would do this, and this is the skill I need, etc. But once you're in the first line leader role, now it's live fire, right? You actually have people reporting to you, and you wake up and realize pretty early on, boy, the skills that made me a good individual contributor, most of those don't relate to being a good people leader. And early on, and every leader has this, right? You have one person, if you're lucky, two, but one person who they walk, talk, think, act, do the job just like you. And you're like, man, that person's a rock star. They're great. They do the job just like I do. Then you have a bunch that are kind of in the middle. They're successful in their own way, but not like you. And then you have one, and hopefully you don't have two, and they're just the exact opposite of you, and they drive you crazy because they do everything different than you. But they can still be successful. And one of the key things to learn is you treat everybody as an individual, and you manage them based on what makes them successful, not what made you successful. But I digress a little bit. So getting someone in a new leader program, ideally in the first 6 months, and really having them use some real cases from their new team, etc. And having them grow, and then building it out to then an experienced first line leader program, someone who's like 3+ years into the role and more advanced skills in the leadership component, right? And preparing people to lead at the next level. And then also, and very few organizations have this, a second line leader plus leadership development program. Because when you become a second line leader, it's the skill of people leadership is still there, but your customers, your stakeholders are much more internal people in the organization, and your leaders, your direct managers, are leading the field teams or the individual contributors. So teaching people to move from leading a unit of people to much more like an enterprise-wide thinking style of leadership, right? So, when I look, so it's okay to have vendors, but you really need to have a prescriptive leadership development program, starting with future leaders, new leaders, experienced leaders, and then like second line leaders plus.
Yeah. No, I think that there's got to be some ownership on the part of the leaders within the organization, because when you bring on vendors, I don't care how good they are, it's still you're responsible for your own culture. So if you bring in vendors, you're now asking them to now help with your culture and core values by bringing on and helping to develop leaders within your company, but they're still not your company, right? So what other key components? Talk to the leaders that exist out there that are listening to this. What other key components do you think you want to tell them they need to keep, take into consideration in not just developing people and bringing more leaders into medical affairs or developing them in medical affairs, but how do they ensure that their culture transcends into the leaders?
Yeah, that's critical, Tom. So thank you so much for bringing that up, because when you do work with external vendors, that they all have like, off the shelf programs they're going to, bring to you, right? That they use for other organizations. And a lot of the guts of that are effective and meet your needs. But every organization is different from a culture perspective. And you need to work with an external vendor that is going to customize it to your needs. And so I had the pleasure a number of years ago, the first time I moved into a second line leader role, moving into a second line leader plus development program. And it was a pretty intense 3-day program. We went through lots of like in-depth case scenarios, but they were all custom made around our cultures of the organization and how our CEO, we had a CEO who was a visionary leader. He very much had a vision for how everyone should lead in the organization aligned to our culture. And so our specific like business cases that we went through as a team and as individuals all, lined up with that culture. So it is critically important for the individuals within not only your organizational development part of the company, who are really responsible for the nuts and bolts of the training, to engage senior leaders in the organization to say, how do you want our leaders to lead? How do you want them to show up? How do you want them to lead our teams, lead our functional areas? How does that marry up to our culture? And then how do we build the training for those leaders, whether we do it internally or bring a vendor in, which aligns with our culture and your vision for the leaders in our organization?
Yeah. I love it. And, so as I'm listening to you, it dawned on me that, so guys, I've been in this industry for a long time now. And I remember Scott many years ago in a number of other roles. So Scott's developed this tremendous career and has emerged as a tremendous leader. So Scott, what's your secret? Tell everybody, how did you do it? And it sounds like you've overcome some challenges. You said you've had some bad bosses and learned some things from bad bosses. And how did you do it? And how did you get to where you are? And what's your advice on what to do and what not to do?
I don't know, Tom. Is that a good answer?
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder how I got where I've gotten, Tom. For me, this sounds simple, and this is a quote you hear all the time. It's by people don't care what you know till they know how much you care, right? Yeah. For me, it's all, I love to connect with people. It's just my passion. I love to help people grow and develop. And I've always seen my role as, how do I unlock each individual's potential to help them be the best they can be, right? I like to quote Matt Campbell. He's the coach of the Iowa State football team. My daughter went to Iowa State, so I have a soft spot for Matt Campbell. But he's the first one I heard say this. I've heard a lot of people say it since, so I don't know that you can attribute it to him, but he talks about making everybody their best version of themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So I always looked at people leadership as, how do I help everybody who reports into me or reports into my leaders be their best version of themselves? How do I help them grow? How do I help them develop? Always be there for people. There's one gift you can give as a leader, which sounds very simple, but in the moment it can be difficult, and it's giving people the gift of time. If someone says, Scott, can I bend your ear? Do you have time for me? I tell everybody on all of my teams, I will always make time for you. My calendar is a little crazy. It might take me a few weeks, but I will always make time for you. But if your direct reports, or even your direct reports, someone texts you out of the blue and go, can I grab you for 5 minutes? Well, you might be in the middle of the most hectic day on earth. But if you can make 5 minutes for that person and give them your undivided attention and listen to because they're coming to you with a problem, right? They have an issue. And you may not be able to answer it in real time right there and then, but the fact that you listen and care and demonstrate that you care for them, it just goes a long way. I'll tell anybody that listen, there's a lot smarter people than me. There's people with greater expertise. I sometimes, like when I sit in like high level senior meetings, which I sometimes get pulled into now, I'm like, boy, there's a lot smarter people in this room than I am. But I think the secret to my success is just really caring for my people and help them grow and develop and always being there to listen to them.
And
That
that's
sounds simple, but that's my answer,
well,
Tom.
and you know what? That I think that's why you're so successful as a leader. And guys, just so you know, Scott had no idea I was asking him that question. I totally put him on the spot with that question, and I think you knocked it out of the park. As a matter of fact, I have quotes that I just put down that I think are just amazing. It is a goal to unlock each person's potential and help them become the best version of themselves is probably some of the greatest leadership advice I think anybody can give or receive, depending on who you are, and give people the gift of time and just say that you will always make time for people, I think is tremendous. I think if we ended this right here, that would be some really good wisdom. But we're not going to end it here. I'm going to put you on the hot seat again. All right, Scott?
Hey,
all right. So that's all great. So what about if you had to change anything or do anything differently, or if you feel like there's mistakes that you've made along the way that you can look back and say, geez, I wish I would have done this differently, what would it be?
Yeah, that's, I make mistakes every day, Tom. So picking one is tough. And I think actually understanding you're going to make mistakes, I think is important. As an individual contributor, and even as a first line leader, I've always been a little bit of a perfectionist. I'm usually glass half full with my teams and my people, but I'm often glass half empty when I look in the mirror. And I need to be nicer to myself sometimes. I'm hard on myself. But in my role now, I'm a third line leader. I lead a group of 50 people. I have 4 second line leaders, and I have 6 first line leaders underneath them, right? There's going to be imperfection in my organization at all times. And sometimes those are the things I focus on. I'm like, why isn't this better? Why are we struggling here? And I need to be nicer to myself at times. But as far as like mistakes I made, I think one thing to understand is I always pride myself on being a great teammate. It's one thing that I've always been a really good collaborator and a teammate. And I'm one that I want people's input when it's time to make a decision, because I think everybody's voice needs to be heard. And they may disagree with me, which is fine, right? I need to hear from everybody. We all bring different experiences and different input to a problem, and someone may look at an issue completely different than I do. And if I don't seek that input, I'm not doing my job. Having said that, sometimes, because it's not a strong suit of mine, we can struggle to make a decision as a team because I'm looking for input from a bunch of people. And sometimes I need to say, okay, people are looking for me to like put my foot down and go, this is the direction we're going, right? So these are things I learn and I try to get better at every day.
Well, thank you for being vulnerable, because I honestly, I know I put you on the spot, and that was I think that was a great answer, and it wasn't the safe answer. It wasn't the easy answer. I really appreciate you being vulnerable. But let's shift gears, and I want to hear from you in what you think medical affairs needs to do to evolve. What does medical affairs need to do to, and I'm not just talking about in leadership development or in this discussion on leadership. I'm talking just in general, loaded question. What's next for medical affairs? What do we need to do to be successful for the future?
Yeah, I think medical affairs, we need, and this is happening and it's more advanced in some organizations than others, but medical affairs needs to view themselves as business leaders, a critical business leader of the organization. Medical affairs is a unique part of a company that I didn't realize until probably 10 years into my career, because a key component of medical affairs is supporting marketed assets and partnering with all your commercial partners, right, in a compliant, appropriate way, right, to support the education of HCPs to impact our patients, right? So there's a key component of your role that supports the marketed components. And let's face it, that's what keeps the lights on in an organization, are your marketed components. But having said that, you also have your foot in the camp of all of your products in development, your pipeline, your near-term pipeline, but also your early pipeline in clinical development. And when you partner with a clinical development team, they want to know how's medical affairs supporting us from a clinical trial perspective, engaging key thought leaders in a space for their input on how we develop a compound, how we move into a new therapeutic area. So you also are in that space too. And medical affairs organizations need to be more active in having a voice in the clinical development of new compounds, but then also playing a key role in understanding that appropriate partnership and collaboration with the commercial side of the business impacts patients too. And we're not just a passive part of the organization that like supports clinical trials, publications, data dissemination, but we have a key seat at the strategic table in early development, but also in life cycle management of your marketed compounds as well.
Got you. Yeah, that's good stuff. I think that it's so critical looking at that, and I'm glad you mentioned the patient, because there's so much emphasis on the KOL engagement piece and driving value and omni-channel, and you hear all these terms now, and there's all these concepts, but at the end of the day, the responsibility is for that engagement to help the practice ultimately help the patient, right? I mean, isn't that the bottom line always?
Yeah, that's why we do what we do, right? We are impacting patients in a more indirect way than if we still were in direct practice, but we're medical professionals who got into this industry to advance drug development and impact patients. That's what we do.
Yeah. Final words of advice. Anything you want to talk about?
I'll come back to leadership, and not just from a medical affairs perspective, but just the topic in general. Every organization, I don't care if you're selling pharmaceuticals, cars, computers, whatever it is. If you're in government, God forbid, do we need better leaders in our government? That's a different podcast.
That's a whole nother conversation.
That's a different discussion, right? Every organization, regardless of what their business is, they need to view themselves as a leadership development organization. And they need to develop strong leaders that invest in their people. And because all of us as leaders, I can see light at the end of the tunnel, Tom. Hopefully it's not an oncoming train, right? My days are numbered to a degree, if you will. But if I walk away and I have a whole group of leaders ready to step in and be more impactful than I am, I've done my job, right? I've developed leaders under me, and all organizations need to look through the lens of, are we developing our future leaders?
I love it, man. That's a great way to close this out. This was awesome. Scott, you're an amazing leader. And I've known you a long time, been following your career. And I think that you're a really great role model for anyone that either wants to be a leader or currently is a leader and wants to up their game. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thanks for having me on, Tom. I loved it.
Awesome, man. We'll do it again. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Take care.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. And if you enjoyed it, please subscribe so that you don't miss an episode in the future. And feel free to leave a rating or a review or a comment. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you soon.